Senator, we're so thankful to have you and your time here on a Friday.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be participating.
Senator, I hate starting these conversations this way, but it is unfortunately some of a true reflection of what's going on in the ecosystem. We have now learned another mass shooting has happened at a FedEx facility in Indiana. You serve in the United States Senate. You have gone through a number of these things as a public official. I lived through Charleston, where 9 people were killed in a church who were just worshiping their God, including my friend and a former client, the late Senator Reverend Clemente Pinckney. Can you speak to this continual reoccurrence of mass shootings happening in this country and what you think we all should be doing to make sure there's some sort of preventive measure so we do not have to experience this?
Yes, well, thank you, Antoine. And I just want everyone to recognize how awesome Antoine is. He is not only a visiting fellow at the Third Way, but when I was running for president, he set up my event at Kiki Chicken and Waffles, and it was really great. And he introduced me to Jamie Harrison, who is now a great friend and someday will be a senator from South Carolina. So thank you, Antoine, for hosting us. Yeah, the issue of gun violence never ends, and it's so heartbreaking and so gut-wrenching. And unfortunately, we've been really stuck up against the NRA and money in politics in a way that's really damaged the ability to find these common sense bipartisan solutions. The NRA is such a, still, despite on the verge of bankruptcy and in bankruptcy, is such a power player in Washington because of the amount of money they spend on campaigns, through mailers, through their members. And as a consequence, we cannot get Republicans to often vote for common sense reform. However, I do see some possibility in the future. I think there's 3 reforms we have to get done. First, ban the assault rifles and large magazines that are designed for military use, and they should be reserved for military use only. They're designed specifically to kill large numbers of people quickly. And I know that gun enthusiasts want access to all weapons made, but they just don't have that right. They don't have access to tanks. They don't have access to manpads. Why do they have to have access to these extremely violent and deadly weapons? And so I believe we should ban them. Second, we should have a universal background checks bill, which when we last voted on it after Sandy Hook, we got, I think, 53 votes. So we were more than half, didn't quite get there. And then the third thing, we need to end gun trafficking, because if you care about Black and brown neighborhoods and stray bullets hitting innocent children like I do, you have to stop these illegal guns flowing into communities like New York City and Chicago, where they're sold directly to gang members, directly to drug dealers, directly to criminals, no chance of a background check. So those 3 things are the 3 things that need to be done. When we had a vote on that, we got 58 votes. So that's my bill. I think that one can pass this Congress on a bipartisan basis. The other 2 probably not, but this would be the kind of reform that I would urge us to vote on if we decide to eliminate the filibuster.
Senator, Speaker Black and Brown, I'm 36 years old. I'm from South Carolina. I've been Black all my life. I'm going to die Black, but I don't want to die because I'm Black. Unfortunately, when I leave my home, there's a good chance a routine traffic stop, which is no longer routine now, could end up in my mother having to plan a funeral. That's happening all too often in our society. We've all seen the tapes. We've all seen the responses from the tape. Police reform, I call it system reform, is needed. What do you say to some of the killings or mishandles we've seen at the hands of law enforcement, particularly, and how they have impacted communities of color?
Well, I think it's clear there is a huge issue with institutional racism within policing. And there's just a different set of rules depending on the color of your skin. And there's so much bias that it makes people unsafe. People of color really are unsafe in many situations. And so I believe we need to redefine public safety from straight up. Second, we need far more training and accountability. We need to have body cameras on all police officers. We need to have mandatory bias training. We need to have accountability if someone is over and over in the middle of excessive use of force issues and has different policing standards for Black and brown people, then they need to be removed from the force. And you need to have transparency and accountability so you can account for all of that. Third, you need to ban things like chokeholds and things that have been used to harm people unnecessarily. We need to expand public safety to include mental health professionals and social workers who can be called in issues of disturbances when the person might be mentally ill, when a family member calls to say, my husband's having an episode and we don't know what to do and he's naked running down the street. There needs to be a way to call a mental health professional or a social worker so that deadly violence isn't used to contain a mental health episode. So that's just some of the problems we've seen. And I'm working with Cory Booker right now on a much more expansive criminal justice reform bill that includes a lot of the things I mentioned, but also will include criminal justice measures as well, and how we change a lot of problems within our criminal justice system globally. So it's a huge issue, and there's too much heartbreak for this country to bear, and it keeps happening over and over again. The most recent tape released is a 14-year-old boy, actually a 13-year-old boy, which is just a few months older than Henry. And I can't imagine the terror and fear and anger that his mother is facing right now. And that's unfortunately the reality of too many New Yorkers and too many people across the country.
You know, speaking of anger, fear, frustration, and confusion, those are pages from the GOP's catalog, particularly when it comes to issues like voter suppression. I was on record after the 2008 election, reminding people that my grandparents are sharecroppers from rural South Carolina. Unfortunately, the same conversation around voter suppression and voter depression they had during their day are some of the same conversations we're having during my day. It seems as if when Black and brown people show up in large numbers, there's a larger effort to suppress, suffocate, and depress our voices at the ballot box. What do you say to what I believe the most consequential issue of our day, voting rights? What do you say to your colleagues who have some sort of pause around passing legislation to secure and expand our right to vote?
Well, I share your frustration. I worked with John Lewis, God rest his soul, on the voting rights provisions that are in the voting reform bill that is part of HR 1 and part of S1. And so I'm very eager to push back against the anti-voting rights efforts of a number of red states around the country, red governors and red legislatures, who are truly trying to disenfranchise voters. Just look at Georgia, look at all the efforts made to disenfranchise those voters, look at the recent legislative efforts there. And despite all the best efforts of people throughout the country who have been litigating, working, creating not-for-profits like Stacey Abrams, we're still under assault. So I would prefer us to pass Voting Rights Act as the first thing we do when we eliminate the filibuster. And I realize there's Democrats who don't want to eliminate the filibuster yet. So I am open to the other two reform ideas. Joe Biden's reform idea of you have to have a talking filibuster. The idea that you can maintain the filibuster except for voting rights and have a specific vote on that, just like Mitch McConnell did it for Supreme Court justices. I would support that and really carve out voting rights as the thing. Or my first choice would just be eliminated altogether. And I recognize that there are huge risks running to do that. But I think if we don't do it, the Republicans will do it because they're that ruthless. And we have to get a few things done, like protect voting rights, like pass these common sense gun violence measures, like making DC a state. These are the kinds of things like immigration reform that we really have been blocked every step of the way for a decade. And so I've been in the Senate for a decade and we've had no movement on those three issues. So I would like to get that done because the American people hired us to get that done.
Let's talk about this big cloud that continues to surround us called COVID. I really want you to speak to, I think, the disproportionate impact, from the economics to the health perspective it has had on communities of color, Black and brown communities. I remind people, when America has a cough, Black America has the flu. We've seen that play out through this entire unfortunate process. What have you felt as a senator from New York, because you all have been hit hard around COVID, and what do you think, where you think we are in terms of a response from a governmental perspective and getting back to a new norm?
Well, I think you're quite right. I mean, Black and brown America have been disproportionately harmed by COVID because of structural inequities in our economy, in our healthcare, in our jobs, in our funding, in our access to capital. And so because of those systemic inequities and systemic racism throughout every aspect of society, that's why this has been so challenging. So first of all, our frontline workers, mostly Black and brown women, who are EMTs, nurses, hospital workers, grocery store clerks, pharmacy clerks. This is the hard work of being on the front line of this pandemic, and those industries have been so hammered. So people have worked constantly, often getting COVID in the process, having worse outcomes because of systemic racism in healthcare. So it's been rough. And furthermore, a lot of businesses have gone out of business, and Black and brown owned businesses has certainly had their more than their fair share of closures, as well as bankruptcies. And then it's been harder to access the PPP loans and grants, because for a lot of businesses of color, they don't have relationships with the banks that already had SBA relationships, so that money could go flowing quickly. So as a consequence, they were slow to get money. So a lot of them didn't survive. That's just the beginning of the problems. And so what we're trying to do in the COVID packages, the last one, the next one, and the one after that, is to try to bring the issue of equity front and center. So for example, in the infrastructure bill, I wrote a bill called Build Local, Hire Local. And the purpose of that bill is to assess the fact that infrastructure, certainly in New York, was built over the last 70 to 100 years in a very disproportionately harmful way to Black and brown neighborhoods. So for example, highways cutting straight through low income and Black communities, highways constantly overlapping in those communities. You look at the Bronx, has the highest asthma rate in the country because of the highway systems all converge and overlap in the Bronx. A place like Syracuse, I-81, goes right through a low income Black community. And so now, because it's 70 years later, these infrastructure, these areas of infrastructure have run the life of their building. So we have to either rebuild it or fix it or do something. And so it's an opportunity to look and say, how can we rebuild it in a way that enhances this community or helps this community? How can we make sure the people who rebuild it are local people who are trained to then do this infrastructure work? And so, for example, in Syracuse, I-81, that we have a community grid model now where that highway will go through the community in a grid way, as opposed to running through it, slicing it in half. We have a similar problem in Buffalo with, again, historic racist infrastructure that harmed local low income and Black communities. And so we have a chance to rebuild it differently. And so that's really important, because you can hire local workers, give them skills that allow for strong middle class jobs, and you can at the same time fix the roads, bridges, sewers that are falling apart right now. So that's one aspect that I'm trying to get in the next infrastructure bill. But we also need to care about soft infrastructure. So because a lot of people couldn't go back to work because of COVID, because their kids were remote learning at home, we need to really focus on the care economy as part of that infrastructure. So that means affordable daycare. Before the pandemic, there was one slot for every 4 kids that wanted it. Now there's one slot for every 8 kids that want it in New York State. So we need to have more affordable childcare. We need universal pre-K to take that whole year and put kids in school. and we need national paid leave, because if we had had that before the pandemic, people wouldn't have had to lose their jobs to stay home with their kids for 3 months. They could have taken a paid leave, kept their place in the company, received income, and the government could have funded the paid leave program, as opposed to through this PPP program and other things that aren't, and the UI that's, we're just constantly trying to get it to the people who need it. So it would have been a lot easier if people could have kept their jobs, and they could have if we had national paid leave.
Senator, the American Rescue Act, I've said to Cedric Richmond, my friend and mentor, I call it the American Survival Act. 0 Republicans voted for it. It seems as if that is going to be the tone and temperature for the Great American Update, what I call it. I think you all may call it the infrastructure bill. What do you say to people who don't vote for legislation but yet take credit for it? And how has the American Survival Act changed places like where you represent, New York, and other places around the country?
Well, it really helped. First of all, we got money to help our state and local governments continue to hire all these first responders so they didn't have to lay them all off. There was money for transit so people can get to work, money for places like airports and Amtrak. There was money for schools, K through 12 schools, that really made a difference to get resources into the schools for PPE, for spacing kids, for more testing and vaccination. Childcare, there was money specifically that we put in for childcare, again, to help this gap that's growing wider. And then unemployment and direct checks to New Yorkers, that really mattered. Extra money, $4 billion to support more vaccines, testing, and healthcare in New York. That was helpful. And then obviously for some of the businesses that were hit hardest, so we put a lot of resources this time into the restaurants. We had the Restaurant Act, which I helped write with a bunch of restaurateurs from New York. Money just for stages, for Broadway and all the venues that have been closed because they can't have performances. And then more money for not-for-profits as well as for-profit businesses, and particularly the underserved. We focused this round of PPP specifically for underserved businesses that didn't get access to these grants and loans before.
Senator, you flirted with the word restaurant, so it triggered something that came into questions from last night. Someone sent me a question about your recent letter on food safety. I think that may be a good way of saying it, and preservatives in food. Can you speak to your letter and your position, particularly you being a mother? I'm sure this is near and dear to your heart.
Yeah, so I read the news just like everybody else, and it said that foods like Cheez-Its and probably 6 other foods that my 12-year-old loves have a chemical in it that are believed to be carcinogenic. And so I've asked the FDA to do an immediate review and to make sure that we're not poisoning our children in the food that is sitting on grocery store shelves. And so this is one of the reasons why I've stayed on the Ag Committee, because I think food security, food safety, and access to food are so fundamental to the well-being and growth of our country. Kids can't learn if they're hungry at school. People can't succeed if they're being poisoned by the food supply chain, and people can't actually do their work if they are malnourished and don't have access to the resources they need to feed themselves. And so I'm working really hard on the whole supply chain issue, food safety, and access to more food stamps, pandemic EBT during this pandemic. But it's something that I keep my eye out on, because as a mom, I'm the one who feeds my whole family. And so most parents are very cognizant of food quality and how important it is to get more fruits and vegetables, more healthy foods into our families. And we certainly don't want poisonous foods to be on the shelves.
Senator, let's switch gears, if you do not mind. Something near and dear to your heart, and something people know you literally around the world for, and that's women issues. Talk about why we should always center ourselves around issues that matter to women. Now, I said to one of your top lieutenants, who's my longtime friend, Alex Phillips, I said to her, when women lead, we all succeed.
Wow, that's awfully nice. Thank you.
I really do believe that. But you have been very passionate around this issue. Talk to us Why, and what do you see as some of the more pressing issues as it relates to women, particularly in this environment we're in, where so many things take up so much oxygen?
Well, first of all, women have lost a net of 5.4 million jobs during the pandemic. Last year undid 3 decades of progress towards workplace equality. And we know 2 things. One, many of the jobs that were lost because women didn't have access to paid leave, childcare, or caregiving options that they needed to go to work. And when kids were sent home and had to remote learn online, that upended so many people's lives and the ability of parents to go to work. Second, we need women. Women account for 51% of the population. We are a growing number of women-owned businesses and industries that disproportionately hire women. They're really important. A lot of us center around essential work. We represented most of the essential workers during this pandemic. And so without women, society does fall apart. And we really can't rebuild a middle class until we make the rules fair and acknowledge that there's real barriers for women to succeed in the workplace. And those are the barriers that I talked about before: affordable, quality childcare, making sure we have universal pre-K, having a national paid leave bill. And we also have to raise the minimum wage, because women disproportionately make up the lowest wage workers. And a federal minimum wage at $7.25 just isn't enough to pay for childcare, food, housing, and everything else a parent needs to pay for. So nobody should be working a full-time job and living below the poverty line. I think it's unacceptable. So we need a living wage starting at $15 an hour, indexed to inflation. And I do believe we should eliminate the tipped wage. And I know it's hard for some restaurant businesses, and I've talked to many of them, but ultimately everyone should be paid a living wage. And to have to rely on tips from a customer who may be harassing you or telling you to smile more or grabbing you somewhere in your body, it's just not right. And so I think too often women are put in a very difficult position to earning a living for their family and being subjected to harassment in the workplace. So we want to make sure that we can have a living wage, ultimately get rid of tipped wage, and over time change the workplace culture so more people can work safely in the workplace.
Senator, South Carolina, we switch lanes a lot, so I'm going to switch lanes on you one more time while we're driving down the road. The midterms. I said to Mr. Clyburn and now Secretary Fudge that in 2018, I thought at that time we're going to be the most consequential midterms elections of my lifetime. Yeah. Well, you fast forward to take the 2022, that word consequential gets shifted to the 2022 midterms, considering the stakes are so high, considering the margins both in the House and the Senate. Talk to us about how important the 2022 midterms will be for the world, not just the country and for places like New York, but for the world. And also, what are you doing to make sure that we are one band, one sound as Democrats, and to help us get across the finish line first?
So I've been raising money for my colleagues for the past 8 years. I created a political action committee called Off the Sidelines. And the purpose of that group was to ask people to run for office who don't typically run, women, people of color, asking them to participate, raising their voices, raising their issues, supporting candidates that share their values. And we've raised over $8 million in the last 8 years for that cause. And we've created giving circles around the country, and they've raised another 10 million. So we're definitely organizing around helping candidates be able to succeed. And there are a number of candidates that are running this cycle. I've been helping my Senate colleagues first. So we just did an event for Maggie Hassan, who's going to have one of the tightest races in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is always difficult. We also have Catherine Cortez Masto, who's also in a purple state of Nevada. And then I want to help Tammy Duckworth. I think she'll be fine in Illinois, but this is an important reelection for her. So I'm doing an event for her in the next month. So those are my first priorities, but I also want to make sure that Reverend Warnock comes back. So I'll be helping him a lot, which I think he's amazing. And then any challengers that emerge over the next months to come, to help them take out a Republican or two. I think there's a huge opportunity to do that. And we just have to stay laser focused on keeping our majority and hopefully flipping 1 or 2 more seats.
So, Senator, you know, sometimes Democrats, we sometimes get cute and not figure out the I think, winning strategy of running the ball right off tackle 5 yards at a time. We get cute. We want to throw the ball downfield sometimes. What message do you think will resonate best for us in the 2022 midterms to make certain we can keep block and tackle, block out this narrative that we can't really win, but really tackle the fact that we can? So that means keeping Warnock, but also pick up opportunities that will exist in this cycle, including North Carolina.
So I think the biggest issues are healthcare still, because we're in the middle of a pandemic, education, because we've seen how that the digital divide really harms students. We've seen inequities in education, how different education has fallen apart during COVID. So we want to restore education, and then jobs. It's all about getting the millions of people who have lost their job through no fault of their own, getting new training, new skills, and higher paying jobs. So healthcare, education, jobs are the issues that I'm focused on. I think they're the most important issues. And then just legislating, getting things done for people. They gave us this opportunity to have the presidency and the Senate. We need to deliver for them. And that's one of the reasons why I will just be urging my colleagues to allow us to reform the filibuster, because I promise you Mitch McConnell's going to block everything. He's extremely political. All he cares about is winning. And so if he thinks the best way for him to win is to tie up the Senate, he'll do it, even though people suffer. So I just don't trust him that he'll work with us. So I'd rather just revise the filibuster and have a governing majority.
So speaking of the Senate for a second, and I'm going to shift gears a little bit. One thing that's personal to me, we know representation matters. We know the importance of being at the table and not on the menu. There is a problem, I think, in the entire ecosystem where in places like US Senate and in the House, as well as legislatures and other places around the country, there are not enough people of color in offices and in places. What do you say, or what do you plan to do to make certain that that changes over time? Because we have to get better. I mean, you've done a hell of a job, i.e. my friend Alex Phillips, one of your top lieutenants. I mean, that speaks volume all by itself, but your colleagues' offices may not look like yours or reflect, I think, the ever-changing browning of America. So what do you say, and what can we do to make certain that's possible?
Well, I think for everyone on this call, it's really important to mentor and sponsor people of color into all jobs, wherever industry you're in. Mentor someone to keep going up the ladder so that they can be successful. Alex is a perfect example of somebody I personally been mentoring for the last couple of years, and she's been a joy to work with. Speaking of joy, my last chief of staff was Joy Cheney, who is now working for the Urban League and doing a great job. So I think it's very important to really try to elevate people around you to continue to succeed. I think it's really important to recruit Black and brown candidates, particularly Black and brown women candidates. I'm very proud of our dear sister, Kamala Harris, who is just making us all proud as our VP. As the first woman VP, the first Asian American VP, the first Black VP. It's home run all around. So keep lifting her up and making sure she's successful. And just, again, keep paying it forward so that more and more people of color can rise in the political sphere, so that we have that diversity of opinion and diversity of experience at the table. Because when you have that diversity, you're going to have a better range of issues raised, a better range of solutions offered, and we'll be able to govern more effectively. And so it is a win-win for this country. And I've done all of that work through Off the Sidelines. And there's been candidates like Lauren Underwood, who I was one of the first to endorse, to send her money and to do fundraisers for her. And now she's just thriving and succeeding. So taking the chance in primaries, taking the chance early in these elections to help candidates of color succeed is one of the missions of Off the Sidelines.
Senator, I think today is 100 days since the incident at the Capitol happened. You were there, obviously it had some impact. From your personal perspective, what did you feel on that day? And since then, what has been kind of your mental response to the events of January 6th?
Well, obviously, it was a devastating day for the country. It was a true attack on our democracy, a violent, brutal, deadly attack on our democracy. with the intention of shutting down the count of the votes. Like, you couldn't come up with a more brutal attack on this country's constitution and democracy. So what we've learned since then is that we just have a growing problem with white supremacy within our country that have been organizing and consolidating power online. It's really opened up a few problems that we need to solve. One, we need oversight and accountability over the social media platforms. They are not regulated. They are doing a terrible job of regulating themselves. They are facilitating corruption, attacks on the Capitol, facilitating anti-Semitism, white supremacy, racism, and it cannot continue. And so we need serious work on accountability. And then we also need the ability for the FBI and our national security apparatus to be able to label them as white supremacy as a domestic terrorist group, so that people who are set and by doctrine there to destroy Americans and American values, that they can be prosecuted and found and held accountable. I also have a seat now on the Intelligence Committee, and so I'm studying the intersection of domestic terrorist groups and foreign terrorist operatives trying to support domestic terrorism, inspire domestic terrorism, and try to undermine both law enforcement and national security. So I'm going to be working on that issue and how we can strengthen our response and prevention.
Then I'll ask you two more questions and I'll let you get back to the people's business. August 28th will be 100 days in office, but it will be the first time President Joe Biden will address the joint Congress. I think 200 people will be allowed into the event for his first State of the Union. What do you expect? What would you like to hear from the president for his first State of the Union?
A couple of things. I'm hoping I will hear a robust support for national paid leave, and I hope it's in his next infrastructure package. I'm hoping to hear robust support for a number of the reforms I'm working on, like covering our service members and veterans who are suffering and dying from being exposed to burn pits, changing how we deal with sexual assault in the military, making sure that we have a holistic approach. We've drawn down our troops from Afghanistan, so we will be drawing down our troops from Afghanistan by September 11, but also having a holistic approach to foreign policy, restoring our standing in the world and national security. So I'm excited to hear what our president has to say, and I'm very optimistic that it'll be a very broad-based set of proposals. I do think he's going to attack global climate change and support aspects of the Green New Deal. I do think he's going to talk about how he's going to restore the country and build back better. And I think he is going to talk about institutional racism and how we can attack it at every aspect. And I hope that he doesn't leave out getting money out of politics, because that is the rot at the center of everything, that until we get money out of politics and truly have publicly funded elections, we'll be dealing with challenges like passing common sense gun reform for the next 100 years. So he really needs to understand that the biggest corruption in Washington is the presence of money.
Senator, in terms of your priorities, because oftentimes things that are on the agenda do not make the priority list. So in terms of your priorities for the next coming days, weeks, or months, what do those look like?
So I just mentioned most of them. I want to help write this next infrastructure bill to have the build local, hire local provisions. I want to make sure paid leave is in it. I want to make sure that the care economy is considered infrastructure and part of it. I'm going to work on our service members because I sit on the Armed Services Committee. So I want to help with the burn pits and I want to help with military justice improvement and get those two things done. I want to revive our economy and help address some of the systemic racism in it. I want to pass postal banking. I did a press conference on that yesterday as a way to help the third of Americans who are unbanked or underbanked and don't have access to things like savings accounts, checking accounts, or microloans. So we want to have that in place. I also want to focus on a domestic workers' bill of rights, again, to address the institutional racism in our economy and make sure that the lowest wage workers can collectively bargain and can have a say in compensation, and then raise the minimum wage. So those are just some priorities for the next 6 months that I'm really hoping to make big progress on.
Why are groups like Third Way so important?
Because they are a convening authority that brings people together to talk about ideas, to talk about how to bring the country together, to talk about how we can propose common sense bipartisan ideas to govern. And I like the fact that they spend a lot of effort collaborating with lots of advocacy groups to come up with the best ideas. I think they are extremely effective at it.
Senator, I thank you for your time on a Friday. Please give my big hugs to my dear friend Alex, and thank you for what you're doing to help keep this country together. You are part of the group. I'll see you soon.
God bless. Take care.